All right, everybody, let's let people get into the room here before we start. If you would, it's been a long time since I've hosted. Why don't you put in the chat where you're from? I'd love to see, where people are viewing from today. Let's see here. We've got Tampa and Jupiter, Collier, gosh, all over the place, Yulee and Miami, DeLand. Wow, they're coming in fast. So Palm Harbor and Polk County, you guys are from everywhere today. I'm really glad that you're able to make it. Volusia and Ormond. Hi, guys. We'll start in just a minute as soon as I can see that the entrance into the webinar room has slowed down a little bit. No, it looks like that might be happening right now. So in the interest of time and respecting your time, I'm going to get started here. Welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program's Homeowner Webinar Series, a series given every third Tuesday of the month at 11 a.m. My name is Jen Marvin, and I'm the statewide education coordinator for FFL. Today we have Dr. Stephen Johnson, who will speak with us about invasive animals in your landscape. First, your microphones have been muted. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. The chat box will be disabled as soon as Dr. Johnson starts speaking. And we will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. And I will be asking Dr. Johnson those questions. Please stick around until the end of the webinar so you can take the exit survey. It gives me a chance to see what kind of programming you'd like for next year and lets us know how we're doing with our series. Our next webinar, it will be August 19th at 11 a.m. We will have Dr. Gail Hansen, a professor in environmental horticulture here at UF, and she will talk about landscape design. Today, we will be talking with Dr. Stephen Johnson, a professor in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation at the University of Florida. Dr. Johnson's expertise lie in the natural history and conservation of amphibians and reptiles with extensive work on imperiled species. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to tell us a little bit more about yourself, please go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Jen. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending today. I'll talk for about 45 minutes or so, and I'll answer as many of the QA questions that we can squeeze in. That'll be up to Jen. But as she said, I'm a professor at UF. I'm located on the main campus in Gainesville. I started out at a satellite campus down in Plant City, so I hear Polk County being here, and I saw on the news there was some area just looks like southwest of Plant City, or right just south of Plant City, that got like 11 inches of rain yesterday, which is just crazy. Probably going to be a bunch of little spadefoot toads metamorphosing in about 2 weeks. So that's a species of frog I will not talk about today. That's a native one, but frogs, so amphibians and reptiles, snakes, lizards, turtles, are my specialty. I've done a lot of work with non-native and invasive species of those groups and others. And so my appointment here is 70% teaching. So I help support our undergraduate program in the Wildlife Ecology Department. And then 30% of what I do is extension or outreach, which is what I'm doing here. So basically 100% what I do is teaching. Here I'm just teaching a non-degree audience. So I'm going to talk about some invasive animals that do not have anywhere near enough time to talk about everything, but hopefully it's some species that you're familiar with or have questions about. But I also imagine you might learn something about something new that might be in your yard today. So without further ado, here we go. Hopefully I can advance. So first of all, I'm gonna define. So I'm gonna use the term introduced species today, and I'm gonna use invasive species, and those refer to different things. And so I'm first gonna talk about that. I've got one slide just to talk about invasive species impacts. Gonna talk specifically about Florida, why we have so many non-native species here, and then I'm gonna highlight each of the major groups. I'm not gonna talk about fish, but I'm gonna talk about birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. So I study vertebrate animals. So if you want to learn about, let's say, invasive snails or invasive termites, you gotta go to somebody else. I'm the things with backbones is what I specialize in. And then I have one slide or a couple slides at the end about what you can do to try to manage some of these things locally and support uh, management of invasive species in general. So first of all, let's start with the definition. So as I mentioned, I have two different terms. So introduced, an introduced species is ones that is a species that whatever it might be, and it varies, might be a frog, might be a snail, whatever. It's been introduced or brought to an area where it was not native accidentally or intentionally by people. So a species that's moved intentionally or unintentionally by humans. If a species is introduced, it does not imply it's going to have negative impacts. And as a matter of fact, many introduced species are beneficial. And I've noticed that, most of the presentations in this series over the past couple of years have really been focused on plants. So I'm happy to talk about a little something different, but many of you have ornamental plants in your yard, and many of these are not native plants. I'm an advocate for planting native species, but as we go with the Florida-friendly yards and neighborhoods, right plant, right place. And so an ornamental plant that you put in a place and it does well and it doesn't go anywhere else, that's great. That provides a benefit. So that species is introduced, all right? It's not invasive. An invasive species, however, is one of those introduced species. So it's something that human has moved, and that is it causes or is very likely to cause harm to the environment and or the economy and or human well-being or quality of life. So invasive species are a subset of introduced species. And if you want to learn more about terminology, I would refer you to this document. I'm going to have a number of links. Maybe you just do a little screen capture or use your phone, but we do a lot of outreach publications at UF Extension, and I've got a number of them I'm going to be referring to today. So when I say something is invasive, I'm saying it's been introduced, and it is usually I'm going to say, hey, it is causing some harm, either to the environment, the economy, or negatively impacting human quality of life. All right, so some examples of impacts. As I mentioned, I would talk about that in the outline. So economic impacts. So this is a staggering number, but the invasive species for costs of mitigation and management of all kinds of things. This is plants, animals, et cetera, pathogens. $1 to $2 billion annually in the United States. So that's a staggering number. So a lot of economic damage because of invasive species. Also impacts to human health. I'll talk about Cuban tree frogs today. They impact human quality of life, not so much with diseases, but you can see right there, infectious diseases that are introduced into the US listed there that are obviously a problem for human health. And then the environmental impacts. This is an area that I have probably the greatest interest. So this is just, again, these are examples. Invasive mammal predators globally, not just in Florida, but around the world, have these invasive mammals, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit, have led to the extinction of numerous species of reptiles, mammals, and birds around the world. So we're talking about here in Florida, but this invasive species issue is a global problem. And one thing I specifically use an example here, 180 species of snails that are endemic to islands in the Pacific. So islands where they're endemic. They evolved on those islands and they only occur there and nowhere else, or sadly they did. About 180 species have gone extinct because of a predatory snail that's been introduced. And this snail is native to the southeast US. This rosy wolf snail, invasive to many islands and caused extinctions. And it's some really sad state of affairs with endemic tree snails in Hawaii. So those are just some examples. So if I've piqued your interest in invasive species and you're really interested broadly, I would encourage you to pick up a copy of this book by Julie Lockwood and her colleague. It's really easy to read. It's very informative, it's inexpensive, and it provides a broad overview of invasive species from a global perspective. So if you like an easy read, this is sit down with a cup of coffee in a couple hours, you can knock that thing out. It really, I think is really, really informative. So I encourage you to check that out, because hopefully you're here because you're a lifelong learner. All right, so now focusing more from globally down into Florida. So Sad, but this is, this is one of Florida's claims to fame. We are a global hub of invasions by non-native species, and there's a variety of reasons why. We have a very mild climate. It's quite wet right now, but in general, it's very mild. We have several major ports of entry where goods are brought in from around the world. And with those goods, there are species that aren't native that we're bringing in intentionally, like I mentioned, ornamental plants, or things that are coming in unintentionally that have hitchhike rides in, goods that we're importing, or possibly in the ballast water of the ships that are coming into our ports. Also, we have a lot of natural habitats, a lot of upland habitats, a lot of wetland habitats that provide potential places for introduced species to get established. And then, as you well know, Florida is we have a huge human population, and many non-native species thrive in human modified environments, and we have those. And then we've got a major trade in ornamental plants as well as exotic animals or pet animals. So we're bringing in things for, again, our own personal use and enjoyment. And some of these species sadly become established and become invasive. And there's just a couple examples there of water hyacinth, peacock bass introduced intentionally for fishing opportunities. They're mainly just in South Florida. We've got the bird, the red-whiskered bulbul, that came in as a cage bird, and now they're established in South Florida. And then this invasive channeled apple snail. So these are a few examples. So, but I'm going to focus now on, continue to focus on Florida and the vertebrate examples that we have here. So again, I'm not going to talk much about fish, but I got some numbers there. So birds, and these are minimum estimates because there's new things being documented all the time. And unless it gets in the scientific literature or makes it into some, social media where I get I can figure out, okay, there's been something new and add it to the list. It doesn't get added to my list. So these are minimum estimates. So birds, around 200 species documented. Fortunately, many of these are not established in breeding, but there are about 15 species. Mammals, we're at around 30 species of non-native mammals introduced to Florida, about half of which are established in breeding. And again, some of these are brought in intentionally, others are brought in on accident, particularly when we're talking about the amphibians, and I'll tell you about some of those specifically. And then speaking of amphibians, about 20 species documented. 5 of them are established in breeding, one of which you probably have no clue about. You probably don't even know this type of amphibian exists. So, but it's a really interesting situation. And then reptiles, we're approaching 200 species. I could probably update that to 200. 200 species of reptiles, non-native, documented in this state. And a lot of them are established and are breeding, dominated by lizards. And then about 100 fish with 40 species established and breeding. So fortunately, many of these species, as you see from those numbers that get brought in, they don't establish, and they're just here, and they stay where we put them, and they don't get established populations. But some of them do become established, and then some of those, fortunately, it's not many, but some of them become established, they spread, and then they cause problems, in which case we would say they are invasive. All right. So now I'm going to give you some examples of birds. I'm just going to overview, as you probably saw in an introductory slide. I have some specific examples of amphibians, reptiles, and one mammal too that I'm going to talk about. So birds, here's kind of the big picture in birds. So we have a lot of introduced, non-invasive birds, but we have some that are established here and we've got enough evidence to show they're invasive. So house sparrows, they weren't introduced initially in the U.S. to Florida. They were in New York, but they've since expanded their ranges. They occur, in human modified environments. They can be aggressive towards native birds. And they just make messy nests and stuff. You see them up in like around shopping centers, or if you go to Walt Disney World, they're pretty common there. And then you're probably familiar with Muscovy ducks, brought in as an ornamental. Their feces can be unsightly and messy. We've got rock pigeons, or just the rock dove, or the standard pigeon, not native, established all over the world, loves to hang out in human modified environments. Their feces can be annoying. They can transmit disease. Those of you in South Florida and Central Florida may be familiar with the Quaker or the monk parakeet. They're the one parrot that does not nest in a cavity. They build a large stick nest, and they're known to nest in electrical generating equipment and cause short circuits. And then this thing, the purple, or really the better name is the gray-headed swamp hen. They're brought in as an ornamental and they escape cultivation. And now they're in a number of wetlands. They're up here around Gainesville, and they eat a lot of vegetation, and they can prey on apparently on some native water birds. And then the very now common house finch was native to the western U.S., brought to the east as a cage bird called Hollywood finches. Now they're all over the place, and they can transmit a disease to some of our native birds. And then moving on to mammals, feral pigs or feral swine, a major invasive species globally, certainly one here in the major one in the United States. Not likely to be in your landscape unless you live next to a natural area, in which case maybe they come out of those natural areas and destroy your landscaping or your yard. Nutria, this very large aquatic rodent. I looked up some resources just yesterday. Apparently there is a lot of sightings from them up here in North Florida, Northeast Florida, around the Jacksonville area. They eat a lot of aquatic vegetation. This thing, this Gambian pouch rat, was brought in the pet industry. It's a transmitter of a disease called monkeypox. It escaped, and my understanding is there's still some of them on a few of the islands in the Florida Keys, but there was an effort to try to eradicate them, but I don't know if that's been successful or not. Then we got the ubiquitous black rat or roof rat that's been transported around the world as long as people have been sailing on ships. Total nasty pests in grain and get into your home. They can bring diseases. No one likes these rats. We have a number of native species of rats that don't cause the problems that the black rat does, but they're a bad one. And then we also have, if you didn't know, we have monkeys in Florida. And there's a major population of this rhesus macaque monkey up here just south of me in north central Florida at Silver Springs State Park. They've expanded out of they were brought here many years ago now, almost 100 years as a tourist attraction, and they have got a disease that they carry and potentially could transmit to people, herpes B virus. It has not happened yet, and let's hope it doesn't happen because that can be lethal in people. I am going to talk in more detail about a beloved pet that is also one of the world's worst invasive species, and that is the feral or outdoor cat. So if you have a pet cat, and I'm sure some of you do, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm strongly encouraging you to keep your cat indoors. Your cat hunts. If you say, oh, my cat doesn't hunt, I would just say you are mistaken. Your cat does hunt, even if it's fed. This is a really bad invasive species globally. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this now. I could do a whole presentation on outdoor cats, feral cats, and management of them. But I know this is a touchy subject. So if I'm upsetting you because you have an outdoor cat, well, maybe you'll realize, hey, I probably ought to keep my cat inside after these next couple slides. So first of all, let's just look at invasive mammals from a global perspective. So this was a paper at a very prestigious journal in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And the authors looked at impacts of invasive mammals globally, all right, not just Florida and not just the US, but globally. And they say that feral cats and outdoor cats, maintained cats that are allowed to go outdoors, are implicated in the extinction of 33 species. This has been really bad in Australia particularly, but 40 birds have gone extinct, 21 mammals and 2 reptiles have been documented as extinct, and the likely culprit right here are outdoor and feral cats, and it's through predation. Now, these extinctions have mainly occurred on islands, so insular endemic, so island endemic species that evolved on islands without predators are very susceptible when a non-native predator like a cat is brought in. And as you know, cats are domestic. They've been brought around the world and often to try to control pests like the black rat. So other things that are causing problems globally, rodents, dogs, swine, mongoose, foxes, and this is an animal like a mongoose called a stoat. So we're focusing here on domesticated cats. All right. So as you know, they've been transported all around the world. They're human companions. I like cats. I've had cats in the past as pets. All of my cats were indoor cats. any pet cat I have the rest of my life is going to be a completely indoor cat, and chances are it will live a very long and happy life. All right. When cats are allowed to roam free or they're feral, they're just wild domestic cats, they can have major impacts on native animals. And I'm citing some studies here that one from Australia estimating over 600 million reptiles and around 4 million birds and over a billion mammals, native mammals, are killed per year by cats that are allowed to run free, either feral cats, and those are the main impacts, but also indoor outdoor cats. All right. In the United States, there was a study that estimated, I have their estimate, they're between 1.5 to 4 billion birds and maybe 6 to as many as 20 billion mammals killed each year. And these are usually, native animals. So cats are major predators. They're a major invasive species. People say, well, if I let my cat outside, I'm going to put bells or a collar on it, and that way it won't harm the wildlife. Well, there's some studies out there that show some of these collar mounted devices, not specifically bells, but this sort of ring that would go around the collar, can help, but they don't eliminate predation. And usually their reduction in predation are on birds and mammals and not on reptiles, for example. So also cats can be a vector for disease to wildlife and humans. Toxoplasmosis, there's some studies in the literature showing impacts in Hawaii on the federally endangered monk seal that was infected by toxoplasmosis, and felines are the only vector, and the only felines in Hawaii are outdoor feral cats, and also rabies, and they can potentially transmit rabies to people. So impacts to wildlife are tremendous, and also potential impacts of disease to wildlife and humans. As I mentioned before, well-fed indoor-outdoor cats still hunt, and then they kill wildlife. And I've heard people say, "Oh, my cat doesn't kill." I'm like, your cat does kill stuff. It's probably just not bringing it back to you. All right. Also, besides the impacts on wildlife, it's better to keep your cat indoors, because if you do a little Google artificial intelligence search, it shows you, hey, indoor cats live 10 to 15 years versus outdoor cats living 2 to 5. I saw that. I'm like, well, where's the science? And so I actually found a study that showed indoor cats living about 10 years on average, whereas completely outdoor cats living around 2.5 years shorter time span. Also, lower incidence of disease in indoor cats versus outdoor cats, specifically for feline leukemia virus. And then there's a really neat study that was done by the University of Georgia and elsewhere, where we put these kitty cams or these cameras on cats, and they found, hey, your indoor-outdoor cat that you're letting around engages in risky behavior. It crosses roads. It also might have, to deal with a coyote that would kill it, or a dog, or people that, poison, an outdoor cat, or it might eat a rodent that was poisoned. So the best thing to do is keep your cats indoors. And I will make this statement that, in my opinion, a Florida-friendly landscape does not have a domestic cat roaming in the landscape or in the yard. If you're interested in more details about this, there's the Wildlife Society, the professional society that is big in my field of study, has a feral cat and free-ranging cat statement with more information. You just Google that and find it. And I was a lead player on writing that one. So today I'm opening up my email and I see some UF news and I'm checking it out. I'm like, well, look in here. There's something about cats. Clearly, we got a lot of education to do. So this UF news thing came up through an email. Research, scientist cat helps discover new virus. All right, cool. So what happened is that this researcher here at UF on the main campus, his cat brought in a shrew, and the guy tested it, and he found, hey, a new type of virus unknown in Florida, or a strain of the virus was discovered. All right, that's a cool observation. So this new strain of orthoriovirus, which I don't know what that is, but apparently it's important we know about it. And the cat Pepper, so it made headlines previously because it killed a mouse and brought it in. And then apparently the cat is still at large, allowing to roam outside. And I was kind of taken back when it says, for readers concerned about Pepper's health, I'm certainly concerned about the cat's health, but I'm more concerned about the health of the wildlife it's killing. So show no illness from that. and will likely continue to contribute to scientific discovery through specimen collection, meaning the UF professor lets it outside and it hunts. I've emailed that professor kindly pointing out that, hey, feral cats, outdoor cats are a major invasive species. Here's some data. I strongly encourage you to keep your cat indoors, sir. And if it needs to go out, build it a catio or an enclosure where it can experience the outdoors safely for the cat and for wildlife. Okay, so I was up on a little soapbox there. I know that's a controversial subject. All right, so we move on from mammals to reptiles. Notice the slides I had before said invasive mammals, invasive birds. These are now the big picture with the introduced and invasive reptiles. And I dive a little deeper because this is my area of expertise of reptiles and amphibians. So big picture from Florida, as I alluded to earlier, about 195, or really let's just say 200 species of reptiles that are not native to Florida have been documented here over the years at one point or another. And about 60 of those are confirmed as breeding. So here's the major group of reptiles we have in Florida. So the crocodilians, we have 4 introduced species. There is actually a documented case of 1 or more Nile crocodiles in Florida. This one that's breeding is the spectacled caiman that is in South Florida that used to be in the pet industry. That's the major invasion pathway, or the way in which most of our reptiles, certainly over the past couple of decades, have gotten to Florida. They were brought in intentionally as pets and then either released or escaped. And I remember seeing caimans for sale in a pet store when I was a kid. Fortunately, my mom had enough sense not to let little excitable Stevie buy a caiman, because once that caiman got to be about 3 feet long, she would not want it in the tub. And what would Stevie do with it? Well, he would probably take it to the local lake and turn it loose. And that's what happened. People have bought things, they can't keep them because the caging requirements get, extreme for some species, particularly like this spur-thighed tortoise, and then they get released. Turtles, around 20 species introduced, 5 breeding, one of which I did have as a pet, the good old red-eared slider, which is now the most widely distributed turtle around the world. Kept as pets. They're really cute when they're small. They get bigger. People don't want them. They intentionally turn them loose. Snakes, around 23 species, 6 of which are breeding. I will touch on one briefly. No doubt you're familiar with the Burmese python, which I'm not going to talk about today because it's unlikely you're going to have them in your yard, but I could talk about them in another presentation. And then lizards. Lizards dominate the introduced fauna of reptiles in Florida. And it's sad to say that we have about 3 times as many non-native established breeding species of lizards in Florida as we have native Florida lizards. Most of these are in South Florida, whereas the majority of our introduced and breeding species of herps, or when I say herps, that refers to herpetology, is the study of amphibians and reptiles. So when I say herps, it means amphibians and reptiles. So most of our introduced herps that are established are in South Florida. And those of you who live in South Florida are no doubt have seen a lot of these. And if you've lived in Florida a long time, you might not even have realized they were not native. And sadly enough, let me go back. Florida is the global epicenter for introduced reptiles. There's no other place in the world that has as many introduced reptiles as Florida does. So a sad claim to fame. Real quick, how they got there. This is historically, they were brought in cargo inadvertently. So this was unintentional or accidental introductions. And then over time, though, it's been more intentionally animals brought in through the pet trade, as you can see here. And this, no doubt, that data point should be higher. These data are a little bit old now, but brought in intentionally for pets, and then they either escape care or they're released when they get too big for people to care for. All right, so here's some examples of now invasive reptiles. All right, Burmese pythons, major invasive pest in Florida. Green iguanas, no doubt. I'm not going to talk specifically about green iguanas today, but no doubt some folks are going to have some questions, and I'm happy to try to answer your questions. And I could cobble together a full presentation on iguanas in Florida and their impacts and management. If you guys want me to do that, just let the folks know at the Florida Friendly Yards and Neighborhoods group. Non-monitor lizards. a lizard native to Africa that's now in several places in Florida. Argentine black and white tegus, same as these other ones, brought in for the pet trade and now is established in around 5 places in Florida and outside of Florida as well. The ubiquitous brown anole, which I am going to talk about in detail, and that's why it's highlighted in red. And then I already mentioned the red-eared slider. That is, it's native to the United States, but not the Southeast. We have a subspecies of yellow-bellied slider, it's called, but this one was brought in and sold in pet stores, and then it's now common around the world. So now let me talk specifically about the brown anole. And I have another reptile that I will say is introduced, not invasive, but you're very likely, I think, or you have a decent chance of finding it in your landscape. And so I bring it up. And I'm trying to include species here that have broader ranges just outside of South Florida, because I know we have participants here from all over the state. All right, so let's talk about the brown anole. All right, so the brown anole, not anole, but brown anole, Anolis sagerii, or sometimes called the Cuban brown anole. This is its range in Florida, all right, as best I know. There are probably brown anole records from here, but these green areas are where it is established and breeding. So throughout the peninsula, along developed areas in the coast in the Tallahassee area. As I alluded to before, I have some extension publications. So if you just go to that URL, again, do a screen capture or just use your phone to take a picture. Or also, if you just do a Google search, brown anole in Florida, UF, you should probably find the link to this article that I wrote with my students. So this image above, these are both native green anoles, or sometimes referred to as our native chameleons. Chameleons, from a taxonomic standpoint, only occur in Africa and Madagascar. They're only native there, at least. We do have several species of chameleons that are introduced in breeding in Florida, but we have one native anole, and because this one can turn from green to brown and brown to green, people, I just think, it's a misnomer, but they refer to it as a chameleon. It's not a chameleon in the strict taxonomic sense, but is a chameleon and it can change its color. All right. So this lizard can go from green to brown and brown to green pretty quickly. They're native. However, the invasive brown anole is always brown, and it's usually speckly and never turns green. All right. So that's one way you can tell them. These are a lot more commonly seen in Central and South Florida. So if you live in this part of the state and you see a brown lizard running around on the sidewalk or on your fence, most likely it's an invasive brown anole, although they do co-occur. These two can co-occur. All right, so let me talk a little bit more about that brown anole. So it is invasive, and I would call it invasive because we know they can compete and depredate, or an adult brown anole can consume a juvenile green anole. However, they're not having huge major impacts, so they're not one that people are really ultra concerned about, like they are Burmese pythons or Argentine black and white tegu. So this is a small lizard, 4 to 7 inches, and TL is total length. Brown or gray bands and flecks. This one with the bar down the back. They're sexually dimorphic, meaning males look different from females. So this is an adult female. These are adult males, and this throat fan is called a dewlap, DEWLEP, and they use that throat fan to signal to other males, rival males, and females, and their throat fan is orange. And the green anole right here, if that male was to fan out its throat, that throat fan would be pink. So that's one way you can tell them apart. So this is the first introduced reptile in Florida. So brown anoles have been here since the late 1800s, all right? How did they get here? If you recall the previous slide, early on the invasion pathway are stowaways and cargo. So inadvertent and unintentional introduction. As you saw, it now occurs throughout the peninsula and isolated areas in the panhandle. They do really well in human-modified environments. They can occur in natural environments, but usually when you see a brown anole in a natural area, like a state park, you see them around a visitor center or a ranger's residence. So they can get into natural areas, but by and large, they're associated with people. So they like to be on the ground and shrubs and trunks. whereas the green anole likes to be and does get displaced higher into the shrubs in a canopy than a brown anole. So if you live on a property that has, nice habitat structure from the ground up into a canopy, you may still have green anoles around and you just don't see them. They're not very detectable because the brown anoles have displaced them higher into the tree canopy, but hopefully you still have them around. So, but because they have impacts on the native species, they're considered invasive. But again, they don't have the impacts like, let's say, a Cuban tree frog does. So I don't emphasize them that much in my outreach. Another reptile I want to talk about, because you may very well see it and has a fairly broad range, is this little thing right here called the Brahminy blind snake. There is a dime for size reference. So this is a brown to sometimes really dark colored snake. They're blunt on both ends. They look like an earthworm. All right. They look like a reptilian earthworm. They move like a snake, but they look like a worm. And if you would see one alive, they have an itty bitty little tongue they flick out. Here's the tail. It's got a little pointy tip on it. Here's an example with someone's hand as size reference that I grabbed off the internet. This bluish gray colored one, that is just an individual that is getting ready to shed its skin. So it's in molt. As you know, snakes will shed their entire skin as they grow. This one's just getting ready to shed. That's why it's that color. So introduced in around 1980, as we thought, cargo, stowaway and cargo. So they're throughout much of peninsular Florida, as well as isolated sites in the Panhandle near major cities like Tallahassee, Panama City, and even farther out towards Pensacola. They are fossorial, so these are burrowers. And so if you're doing, excavating and doing yard work, you might see one of these in some soil. And that's why I wanted to put it out there. And occasionally they get into people's homes. And in far South Florida, they will be in natural areas like pine rocklands and tropical hardwood hammocks for those of you living in the Miami-Dade area. Really interesting. They are parthenogenetic, meaning they reproduce clonally. So they're all females and they just make clones of themselves. So they're really good at moving around and getting transported. One of their common names is flower pot snake. And so if you transport an ornamental plant with one of these individuals in it, maybe it has its origin from Costa Farms here in Florida and it gets shipped to, I don't know, Southern California, and you have one of these in it, it can establish a new population because you only need one individual, again, because they are clonal in their reproduction. So impacts, we don't really know. Doesn't look like they're having much of a negative impact. Not all the research has been done, but right now I'm just going to refer to them as introduced. Heck, because they eat ants, eggs and pupa of ants and termites, maybe they have a positive impact. I'm not saying that's the case. I don't really know, but they're not one of major concern, but they're not native and you may see one. That's why I've included them here. All right. So those are a couple reptiles. All right. So let's move on to the amphibians. So introduced, again, non-native, but not having impacts. I've got one of those I'm going to talk about, or really, I guess two, and then the invasive ones. So about 15 species that have been documented at one point or another. This should be up higher. That's more than 3. I need to correct that because you already see we have several species of frogs and an introduced thing called a Sicilian breeding. So that should be 5 that are confirmed in breeding of amphibians. And there are 3 major groups. All right, there's salamanders. That's a major group of amphibians. There's frogs, which no doubt you're familiar with. And there's this thing called a Sicilian that you're probably not familiar with. So a number of salamanders that have been documented, none of those are breeding. A good number of frogs, some of which are breeding and cause problems. And now this one Sicilian. Matter of fact, I think my salamander numbers might be off. I need to update this. Apologies for that. So here's a few examples. The cane toad, or also known as the bufo toad, established, breeding, invasive. Cuban tree frogs, been here in Florida over 100 years. They're established, they're invasive. The greenhouse frog, been here well over 100 years, approaching 150 years, established, and we don't see any major impacts here in the southeastern US. So in Florida, we don't consider them an invasive species. Maybe they are in Hawaii, but they're not here. And then this one is the most recent amphibian of note, this thing that looks like an eel. It's not an eel, it's an amphibian. It's one of a poorly known group of less than 200 species of known globally of this thing called a Sicilian. And we have the only known introduced established species of Sicilian in the world is this thing, this Rio Quacca Sicilian, that is known from some canal systems in South Florida, Southeast Florida. Is it invasive? We don't know. Not enough research has been done. You're not likely to see it in your yard, but I wanted to make you aware of it. So I'm going to talk about these three species now. Okay, first of all, the introduced, but I won't call them invasive, greenhouse frog. This is, you see, this is the range of the greenhouse frog in the southeastern U.S., occurring in a lot of the state of Florida. If you want to learn more about them, again, I'll direct you to this link here. Here's a photograph of one with a little line on the side. Interestingly, they do not have a tadpole stage, so a very small miniature version of the adult hatches out of an egg, and they lay their eggs terrestrially. I'll show you in a minute. So no doubt you have these around your yard. If you're in Central and South Florida, you might not see them, but you might hear them. They have a very faint call that sounds like tinkling or dripping water. I think it sounds kind of insect-like, if you will. And if you go online, you can look that up and see what they sound like. So this little small brown frog, the greenhouse frog, only about an inch long. They're mottled. They may have a stripe on their back. They may not. There's two different morphs: pointy snout and long, thin toes. Suburban settings, particularly, around in yards. If you're moving an ornamental plant, maybe you pick up a potted plant, a little brown frog hops away. It's probably what this is. So, and they also can get into natural areas. They invade natural areas. As I mentioned, they are direct developers. They do not have a tadpole that's swimming in a pond. They lay their eggs terrestrially in a moist environment. They're the only frog in Florida that does that. All of our native frogs have a tadpole stage. And here you can see some eggs. And there's those little developing embryos. Those large eyes, or large black spots, are the eyes of the developing frogs. And that little miniature version of the adult will emerge from those eggs. And introduced in Florida back in the 1800s. All right, so native to Cuba and the Bahamas. These two came out of my pool skimmer when I lived in Lakeland down near Plant City. Who knows what impacts they're having? They've been here a long time. There's no real obviously negative impacts. Could they compete with some of our native herps, our native frogs? There's a couple species that might, but the research isn't in, and it's not an obvious impact if it's there, and they're not much of a problem for people. But they're not uncommon in your landscape, which is why I bring them up. All right, this next one, those of you in Central and South Florida who have pet dogs and cats that you hopefully keep inside need to pay attention to this one. So this is the cane toad, marine toad, or commonly referred to, or in the past at least, as the bufo toad. This is an invasive species. So below, this is in this bottom image here, that's a female on the left and a male on the right. I put this up here to point out we have several species of native toads, particularly this southern toad that's native, and it occurs in the same places as cane toads can occur. The native southern toad, both of these have these glands on the shoulders that emit a toxin. The glands on the shoulders of cane toads are much larger than the southern toad, and the southern toad is not toxic to your pets. It might be distasteful, but it is not going to harm them. When within the cane toads, it could potentially kill them. Also notice cane toads have this sort of bony ridge over the eyes. You can see this one right here, bony ridge over the eyes, and then this dip in the top of the head. Whereas the southern toad does not have that bony ridge. It has these little crests, or these little horns, if you will, on the top of the head, which the invasive cane toad does not have those ridges, or those little crests on the top of the head. That's how you can tell them apart. When they're small, less than an inch long, they look very, very similar, and it's very tough to tell them apart. So here's the range of the cane toad. They certainly could occur in this area. This is where they're established. I'm not saying they aren't there. I'm just saying we don't have good records of them. They haven't been reported, and they're slowly expanding. I guess I assume over time they're going to diffuse in their dispersion and be in all of Central Florida. So if you live south of Ocala, I'd say, hey, be on the alert. You might have these things here. And if you want to learn more, here's a link to an outreach publication we have on them. All right, so the cane toad, sometimes referred to as the bufo toad, they're really big. They might get 6 inches long. They're brownish to gray. They have large warts on their back. They have these large parotoid glands that are on the shoulders that emit a very noxious, potentially lethal secretion to a dog that would encounter one, or a cat, particularly if it bites it or swallows it. Uh, so they are a socioeconomic problem. They don't get into natural areas for whatever reason, so they're not a major impact on our native species, at least right now. They're really common in suburban and agricultural areas. They like to breed in retention ponds and ditches and canals. They rarely invade natural areas here. But as I mentioned, potentially poisonous and lethal to dogs and cats. And they do get really big. A 9-inch one is a massive one. 5-6 inches is usually how big they get. And if you see if you're in that range I showed and you see, wow, that's a really big toad, it's very possible it's this cane toad. So uh, ecological impacts, not well documented or studied in Florida, but this is a major pest in Australia. They've caused declines of native Australian animals that eat them and become and are poisoned to death. And they start out small. Here's a little baby cane toad that emerged from the tadpole stage recently, and you can see it sitting on a penny. So they start small, they can get really big. Then we move on to one of my claim to fame, the Cuban tree frog, which is, as you can see, occurs throughout the peninsula of Florida. Also, it's continuing to expand its range in the Panhandle for those of you who live out there, mainly along the coast. This is where it's established in breeding. There are records around these areas, but I don't think they're established in breeding yet. I'm not sure. So you can help me. If you see little juvenile uh, uh, Cuban tree frogs in areas not on this map, I'd like to see a picture. I'd like to hear from you via email. And in my email address is in that first slide. It's tadpole is my email, tadpole@ufl.edu. We also have an outreach publication on them. So there's an example of an adult. You can see a young one or a juvenile, grayish, brown, green, with a light line coming from the eye down the side of the body and little warts on the back. So they're quite variable in their colors, but they are a tree frog. So whereas cane toads are toads, they don't climb well. These Cuban tree frogs do climb really well. They have these large expanded toe pads that allow them to climb up the side of buildings or on walls. They're very, very arboreal. They have very warty skin, a bunch of different size warts from small ones to really large ones. They do not have warts on the top of their head. And if you were to have this frog in hand, this is adult female, you would see the skin on the top of the head is fused tightly to the skull. And because of that, the warts don't grow on top of the skull. They have these large bug eyes. They have a yellow wash that is often visible in their armpits or their groin, and they're highly variable. They might be white, they might be green, they might be brown, they might be gray, they might be a combination of colors. They might show a pattern or they might be unpatterned, all right? So it's just really variable. So sorry about the typo here. So wooded areas is what they like. They get into suburban neighborhoods and natural areas, but they like really wooded areas that's nice and moist, all right? They've been here since the 20s, native to Cuba and the Bahamas, and here are their impacts. Eating native tree frogs. They are major predators on native tree frogs. They have caused the decline of our native tree frogs like squirrel tree frogs and green tree frogs. And sadly, now this Cuban tree frog is the most commonly seen tree frog in Central and South Florida. Also, their breeding calls can be annoying. There's been scientific studies to show that the Cuban tree frog tadpoles compete with native tree frog tadpoles. They have noxious skin secretion. So if you handled one of these frogs without a glove on, it will get all this mucus on you. That can be very irritating to your eyes or your nose. They invade homes. I get an email today from someone in Escambia County in the Panhandle, and it was a picture of a Cuban tree frog in their toilet. They also can invade electrical equipment like AC units and things like that, so they cause problems there. All right, so what could you do about Cuban tree frogs? For them and cane toads, you can capture them and euthanize them, and I'll have a slide here at the very end about that. So with Cuban tree frogs and cane toads, you can use a plastic bag as a glove to capture them. Here's one where this lady is grabbing at this Cuban tree frog with a plastic bag as a glove. You can also set up these PVC pipes. I've got an outreach document on that. The frogs go in there. You can create a little plunger to get them out and get them into a clear bag to make sure you have the Cuban tree frog and not a native one. And then you mainly euthanize them. You can dump out breeding sites that have tadpoles, and also you can cover your standpipes. This is a pipe on the roof of your home that allows your plumbing to work properly. It allows toilets to drain and sinks to drain. And these Cuban tree frogs can sometimes get on a roof and they go down in those pipes seeking refuge, and then they move till they get to water where they might end up in your toilet. That's how they get into people's homes. So I encourage humane euthanasia. So for both Cuban tree frogs and cane toads, hand capturing them, you want to be sure you're accurately identifying them before you euthanize them. You basically want to anesthetize the frog either with a chemical means, but more likely by chilling it in your refrigerator. I know some of you are cringing. I'm not going to put a frog in my refrigerator. Okay, I get that. You could probably just put it straight in your freezer if you'll go with that, but it's better to refrigerate it, or you're physically or chemically anesthetizing it. You can rub a benzocaine ointment on it if you want to go to that extreme, but you want to ideally chill it out and then put it in your freezer overnight to kill it, and then dispose of it in your garbage. It's not going to transmit any disease to your food. Your ice cream is not going to taste like a frog or anything like that. Okay. And if you can observe that and learn more about cane toads, and it applies also to Cuban tree frogs, by watching this video. There's the link. Also, those links are included in the outreach document on cane toads. And then finally, this is the last slide. What can you do? Well, you can be a responsible pet owner. So if you're going to purchase an exotic pet, know what you're getting into. All right. If you have an exotic pet, let's say a lizard or a turtle that you're tired of, don't release it. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, or FWC, has what they call a pet amnesty program. If you got a lion or a tiger living in your house, in your garage, and you're like, I really need to get rid of this thing, they will find a home for you, no questions asked. All right, that's the amnesty part of that. Also, I point out, be a responsible pet owner. Keep your cats indoors. You could join a local invasive species management area group. You can report seeing invasive species on this EdMaps or this I've Got One app. Also, iNaturalist, if you're familiar with that. Become more educated, educate others. And if you ever hear about any legislation to try to, put some more stringent rules and regulations on keeping exotic animals, and you think it's worthwhile, you could support that legislation as well. If you have additional questions, again, please feel free to reach out to me. If you can't remember that email, just Google Dr. Steve Johnson, University of Florida. If you Google Cuban tree frog, you're going to find me. That's my claim to fame. And I'm happy to try to respond to your emails. And now I will stop and take as many questions as Jen cares to share with me. I hope you've learned something here. I hope you keep your cats indoors. I hope you know these invasive animals that you might have in your landscape, and you make efforts to remove them just as you would invasive plants. So thanks a lot for listening, and I'll try to answer questions now.
Thanks, Dr. Johnson. Just so that we can go over this again, your email is tadpole@ufl.edu.
Correct.
And a lot of your publications are on EDIS, EDIS,
Yep.
which is Ask IFAS. I believe it's .com or .org. So it's ASKIFAS. And you can search by Dr. Johnson's name, or any keyword that you've seen here today.
Yep. And there's my email address,
Oh, great.
tab@ufl.edu. And there's my website. I have a lot of this information posted on my website. Also information about IDing native frogs and snakes. So you
Great.
might want to check that out too.
Great. Just a few, I know this is going to be a question. You said that a place to report what you think might be an invasive out of the demonstrated range is
Ed Maps is a good one to do that. So
okay.
this website right here, that is for non-native species of plants and animals. The University of Georgia maintains this. Uh, if you can also report this, I've got one app that you can
Mhm.
download to your phone. They're integrated. And then I would just encourage you as well. This Ed Maps communicates with iNaturalist, but iNaturalist is just a great place for reporting native species as well. It's a citizen science platform for reporting observations. But EdMaps is a good place to report it. And it has value in that if enough reports occur in a certain area, the state might be like, oh boy, we've got a new population of tegus showing up here and we need to do something about it. So you can, that's part of, that's part of helping, is letting scientists know where you see these things.
And generally you would need a photograph of that to report?
Want to report a photograph because you have to, we got to
Okay.
have confirmation,
Great.
and verbal or written explanations are they're not a picture.
All right, great. I just wanted to make that clear before we go farther. Um, let's see. One comment about cats. Let me go back up here. One of our viewers was wondering which publications you got numbers from, as far as
You would have to email me independently for that. Although I would refer you to the Wildlife Society's position statement on free ranging and feral cats. We updated that. A committee was on. I was on, and we have a number of citations in there. If you're talking about the collar mounted devices, you could email me independently, and I could send you some PDFs of the science there.
Okay. They also wanted to mention the catch and release programs to control
Yeah,
outdoor
I
animals.
didn't go into that. That's called trap, neuter, release.
Mhm.
That is not a silver bullet for getting rid of outdoor cat populations. Sometimes those things work and there's some attrition. Many times they do not work. I would also refer you to EDIS. If you Google UF EDIS, trap, neuter, release, you will find an outreach publication we did. They probably help in certain situations, but they're not the solution. It's integrated with cats. Trap, neuter, release, and just encouraging people to keep their cats inside. That's really that's the solution. It's easy to do, but if you have a cat that's used to being outdoors, I understand that might not be easy for you. But I would encourage that and encourage your neighbors to do that as well.
Great, thank you. Let's go to a simple one, which I have a question about too. What is the difference between a frog and a toad?
Aha, here we go.
Yep.
There's another outreach document that I have had on my list to write for years, and I will do it soon. So all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. A toad is just a specific type of frog. All right. And toads, it's in the family Bufonidae, if you want to talk the scientific lingo. And they're really diverse from a global perspective. But in Florida and really in the US, our toads are plump, squat animals. They're usually brown. They're not really boldly colored. They have warts and they hop around on the ground. They generally don't climb well. They're pudgy little things. Globally, though, toads are quite variable. But yeah, so it's just a specific type of frog. And they also have this. They have these glands, these parotoid glands on their shoulders, and also as a group, frogs only have teeth in their upper jaw. Uh, Toads do not have teeth in their upper jaw. So toads don't have teeth. So toads are toothless. So that's another thing, but you'd have to have the animal in hand to see that. So yeah, they're just a specific type of a frog. And no, you cannot get warts if a toad pees on you. They're just voiding their bladder when they're picked up because they've afraid they're going to get eaten by the would-be predator, being you, and they void their bladder to try to startle the, the would-be predator. So yeah, they're just,
I didn't know any of them had teeth, so
yeah.
that's surprising to me. Let's see. But just before I forget, what is the best resource to identify what you think might be? Like, can you take a picture and like maybe like some of the plant apps, you can take a picture and it will identify it for you?
Yeah, you can do those things if you have, your phone, and iNaturalist is good about that
Okay.
if you post something, but I know your phone apps, I know my phone, if I take a picture of something and I sort of swipe up, it will
Okay.
do an ID, but let me warn you, the AI is only as good as the data it's relying on. And I've had people email me on numerous occasions, hey, AI identified this as such and such as I'll just make an example, ones I know of, as a wood houses or an American toad. What is it? And I'm like, what's a southern toad, or it's a cane toad. So don't right now, it's not 100%, it's not foolproof, but you can use your phone, you can
Okay.
upload to iNaturalist, and people go through there a lot and they confirm. Or if you want to, you want to just send an email to me. I don't respond to all the emails I get. I just get too many of them, but I'm pretty good at responding, particularly if you're persistent. And if it's a decent image, I can tell you, I can tell you what you
Okay.
have.
Okay. Let's go. Can you talk about peacocks?
Huh.
Can you
A
just
little bit. So not
just in general?
Yeah, not native to Florida, obviously. There's populations of them scattered throughout the state. One of them I was very familiar with growing up in Orlando. I'm a native Floridian. I grew up in Orlando, and my mom would take us over on this place called Genius Drive. Is where there were peacocks living. Uh, they're loud. The calls are very loud and raucous. But I don't get a lot of emails about them, so I don't get the impression that they're causing too many problems for people. I'm not under any impression that they invade natural areas, so it's not like they're having any, major negative impacts. But they are not native here.
Okay. Um, the pictures of brown anoles that you showed, are there, the viewer said that they are interesting variations. Are there brown anole subspecies or are these all similar, all the same species?
These are okay. The ones here. So again, I'm not.
Mhm.
That's probably a male. These
Okay.
are the ones above are the native ones. These are
Okay.
just, yeah. That's all one species. They're highly variable. They never turn green. Brown anoles never turn green. Sometimes they might have a little bit of a reddish colored head, but I would say, they're quite variable. Often they're flecked. Sometimes they're solid color, and the males occasionally can get a little crest that will form on the top of their back or their head. The best feature, if it's a male, is that orange dewlap. But I will point out that we have, I don't know the exact number, but it's over 10 species of introduced anolis. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to escape this, and hopefully I'm still sharing. Let me go to my,
Yes, you're still sharing.
all right, brown anole. Where's my brown anole?
Guys, this is Ask IFAS.
Yeah, I'll
The
go. So
EDIS.
here I go. I'll go UFEDIS, brown anole. LE, and I hit that, and there it comes up. The first one that comes up. So this is me and some past students. So we've done a lot of these, and then you can click over here to view it as a PDF. But here's a picture of this one is from down in South Florida, the reddish head. There's a picture of one there. Here's one, you saw that one. There's a male with its crest. Uh,
And these are all invasive, correct?
yeah, this is
These
invasive
we're
brown
seeing.
anole. There's one with the dewlap. And then we talk similar looking species. There's a picture of those green anoles. There's a male green anole with its pink dewlap. Here's a female with a little line down the back. And then here are other species of anoles that look like brown anoles. This is the crested anole in South Florida. This is a bark
Mhm.
anole. Excuse me, that's another crested anole dewlap. There's the bark anole, another species of anole that's not native to Florida. And then here's, where it is, and just a lot of information about it. Look at there's my cat, right? That's my cat Jasmine, who was on a porch. That anole got into my porch and she killed it, but she never went outside. But there's an example of one of those, one of those outreach publications that you can get at the IFAS. And again, you can download this PDF and, they're just printed or show it to folks. And it's really a great resource. So,
Mhm.
and again, this is what I'm going to do, the toad versus frog. So after I get a bunch of emails about something, eventually I write these documents, and then it's easy to say, hey, go click here.
And by the way, everybody, this is Ask IFAS, and the EDIS publications are available for almost anything that IFAS studies, including plants.
Yep.
We have a large,
Gardening, whatever,
yeah,
all kinds of stuff. It's a great resource. There's thousands of
wonderful.
these publications.
It's wonderful. Let's see here. What is the mature size of a black and white tegu?
A black and white tegu might be as long as 4 feet, including the tail. So they get pretty big, uh, and they're apparently they make good pets. They can, but the ones that are now established, I do not. That's another document that I need to
Mhm.
write. But there's some in Polk County. There are ones in Charlotte County. There's a population in Homestead over in St. Lucie, and all of these are looks like from escaped pets from breeders, and now they're regulated in Florida and elsewhere in the southeastern U.S. But they're a very large, heavy-bodied black and white lizard. And interesting thing about them, they can deal with cold really well. They brumate or they become inactive during our winter time of year, even in South Florida, where it never gets gonna get cold enough to really cause them any damage. But they become inactive, and this is allowing them to expand their range further north. So
Is that a little bit like iguanas as well? Kind of the same
iguanas, the
thing?
green iguanas aren't going to get that far north just because they're too tropically adapted. Same thing with probably Burmese pythons,
Okay.
but the tegus, yes. If you live in the Panhandle, they could get established there eventually. I mean, fortunately, the state has now cracked down on the ability to have them as pets, and that hopefully will stop the situation and try to get under control. But there's always these established populations, and just because something's against the law to keep doesn't mean people aren't going to keep it. So,
Mhm.
keep your eyes open, and very important to report potential sightings of Argentine black and white tegus anywhere in the state, not just in the Panhandle, but anywhere. That's one that's really, really important to let people know about.
Are there any others that are that integral to report that, I mean,
I
obviously
would
they're all
say any really large lizard now monitors as well. We have other species of monitor lizards that are that I've been seeing in places in Florida. So our native lizards don't get that big. So if you see any lizard that's a foot long or bigger, particularly if it's 2 feet long or larger than that, that's one that you want to try to get even a decent, some sort of picture of and report, because it's not going to be native. I would say, and you probably don't need to bother reporting observations of brown anoles unless you live in the Panhandle of Florida, where we don't have a great idea of where they occur. And again, they're expanding the range. But if you're in the peninsula of Florida, it's not really crucial to be reporting brown anoles or even Cuban tree frogs at this point. I don't say don't do it, but
Mhm.
just don't, like, oh, I don't have time, and no big deal. A big lizard or a really giant snake, probably report it. That'd be a good thing to do.
Uh, just another quick species question. Why is the Brahminy a snake and not a worm?
Because it's a reptile. So that's all. And being a reptile, it's a vertebrate. It has a backbone. It's just a really small thing that looks like a worm. So it's
Mhm.
certainly the smallest snake we have in Florida. The largest one is the native eastern indigo snake. But yeah, because it's a reptile and not an invertebrate, that's why it's not a worm. Although it looks like one,
Yeah.
and it could easily be confused with a worm.
I guess one more species question, and I cannot pronounce this. The Rheococa,
Sicilian.
yes. Is it a snake?
No, not a snake. It is so, as I mentioned, there are three current living major lineages of amphibians. So there are frogs, there are salamanders, and then there's this other poorly named group called Sicilians. Sicilians are native to tropical areas around the world. They're not native to Australia, however. And this is one that's a fully aquatic one. Some of them burrow in mud and stuff. This is a fully aquatic one that's been popular in the pet trade. So it's one of the amphibians. It doesn't have gills. It doesn't have fins, so it's not a fish. It's related to frogs and salamanders.
Oh,
And as I said, this is the one place in the world where scientists have documented an established population of Sicilians. And apparently there are a lot of them in the C4 canal system. My colleagues have said they've gone down there to trap them. And one of our students did this. She's from South Florida. Over spring break, she went down. She goes, I'm going to see if I can catch these. So she dropped this trap. It was about that big. It was a minnow trap, basically a cylinder with two funnels on each end. And the preferred bait is Vienna sausage. She baited the trap with Vienna sausage, dropped it in the canal, tied to a string, came back about an hour later, and she thought the trap was hung on the bottom. It was full of Sicilians. She pulls it up. You couldn't fit another one in there. There were like 40 or more Sicilians in there. So clearly they are very well established, and it's very possible they've made it into the Everglades. And what impacts they have, we don't know. You can't look to, history would show that they're not going to be a problem because here they've not been introduced anywhere. So again, that's not one you're going to see in your yard. If you live in South Florida on that canal, maybe you'll see them, but it's not like you're going to be gardening around and have one show up like one of those little flower pot snakes or the greenhouse frog. But just one I thought I'd share because it's really interesting and potentially of global significance. Time will
and
tell.
it's not invasive. It's just been introduced.
We don't know yet.
Okay.
It's too early to tell. I would bet long term we'll probably say, yeah, they're invasive. They're probably going to have some impacts, but we just don't know yet.
Okay. I do have a question about, and I'm not sure that you study this, a brown basilisk.
Yep, brown
Um,
basilisks. As a matter of fact, let me go back to this. So we go, let's try, I think we've got one. Brown basilisk, Edis. Let's see if we've got one. There you go. Brown basilisk in Florida.
Okay.
Eugene Scioli used to be an extension agent. He's now since retired, but there you go. So there's there's
Wow.
information on brown basilisk lizard. So sometimes called the Jesus Christ lizard because young ones run across water. So, and
Right.
then here's their range as best we know. So also a southern, South Florida thing. So those of you who are interested in brown basilisk, you can go check that out.
Are those invasive?
Again, not a lot of research has been
Yeah.
done, so can't really tell. Generally, they live around humans and human modified environments, but I just don't know. The majority of these non-native species, there hasn't been adequate research conducted to see if there are impacts. They're probably more subtle. They're not real overt or obvious, but we just don't know. And some might argue, hey, we might want to err on the side of caution and say, yeah, there probably will be, it's sort of the guilty until proven innocent type
Mhm.
thing with these introduced species.
Okay. Then a question about maybe common names. Are greenhouse frogs also known as peepers?
No.
Okay.
So from a common names they're variable. So from the standpoint of birds, all North American birds and maybe even globally, but certainly in North America, they all have it's an accepted common name. So
Mhm.
like you have northern mockingbird, people know what you're talking about. With frogs, not the case. But with there's a frog called a peeper that's called a spring peeper that is really common in the eastern U.S. They're in Florida, but they only get as far south as Central Florida. So since you bring it up, we'll go if you Google UF Wildlife Home, you'll find my website. So UF Wildlife Home right there. And I go to Florida frogs and I'll click
Great.
here in North Florida and I'll click, they're a type of arboreal frog. So I click that and I go down to spring peeper. So there's one and there's its range. It's only in Central Florida. And it's called the spring peeper, but in Florida, it only breeds in the wintertime. So we should call it the winter peeper, but that's not the case. And also at that same site, if you looked up the greenhouse frog right here, I think there's a spot you might be able to find we have a link to the call. No, I don't have a good space for the, there it is. If you go to this USGS, you can hear the call. Now, they look similar to a spring peeper because they're small and they're brown, but the spring peepers are arboreal, and you're not going to see them in your landscape or your garden, whereas you almost certainly will see the greenhouse frog.
These are great resources, by the way. That's ufwildlife.ifas.
Yeah, I've got one on, on snakes, snake ID, same thing. So if you're in South Florida, what are you seeing? And it's done by pattern and
Wow.
so there you go. So, and we got about 50 species of snakes in Florida. I'm happy to come back and talk about Florida snakes or just focus on venomous
Yeah,
snakes. And I will say a Florida friendly landscape has snakes in the landscape. I
absolutely.
understand if you don't want venomous snakes in your yard, but if you have, non-venomous ones, I would encourage them, build some habitat and, they're snakes and all of our wildlife they're losing places where they can live because, we're developing it for homes. And, those of us who are concerned about these wildlife, I do a lot of native landscaping in my yard. I have a little brush pile. So
Mhm.
I'm not discouraging animals. I'm more encouraging animals in my yard, particularly pollinators, by having, a lot of native plants. But
Mhm.
there's going to be a lot of, right plant, right place,
Yeah,
non-native ornamentals that'll be good for pollinators as
absolutely.
well. So these animals, our native species need our help. And I'm imploring you to, to be a good steward of your natural environment and be an advocate for your native species. That's why I say, capture and humanely euthanize
Mhm.
Cuban tree frogs, being an advocate for our native frogs. I understand not everybody's willing to do that. Okay. But I encourage that and hopefully provide you resources where you know how to do that in the proper way.
And this is a great resource, by the way. Your lab page is wonderful.
Yeah, it gets a lot of visits. There could be a lot more things on there, and some of this stuff is outdated. I don't have a webmaster anymore.
Mhm.
Uh, but the Florida snakes, the frogs, Cuban tree frogs, there's a lot of good useful information there, I think.
What would you, this is a question I know is going to be down farther, but what are the most dangerous animals that you talked about today to pets, especially like dogs?
Without a doubt, it's the cane toad, the bufo toad.
Okay.
Uh, so it's that guy right there. So
Yeah.
that is not as much an environmental concern as it is a socioeconomic concern and
Mhm.
socioeconomic impacts because this frog, it's a toad, but it's a frog.
Mhm.
It has these large glands on the shoulder right here, uh,
Mhm.
that when those glands are under pressure, the gland has all these little pores or these little ducts that can squirt out this very thick, sticky, viscous toxin. And if that gets in your dog's mouth, well, if your dog swallows a decent sized cane toad, your dog sadly is probably going to die. But it can get very sick from this, and you would want to take it to the vet and know what to do. Sometimes it's not a big deal. Other times it's a real problem. And on this video, I had a link to it, me rinsing the dog's mouth out. I would say less of that now than getting a really nice damp rag and wiping the dog's gums and
Mhm.
its inside the lips out multiple times and get it to your vet. Better to err on the side of caution, I would say. And at my website, if you go to Florida Frogs, there's we have native frogs, and I don't want you to
Mhm.
be euthanizing the wrong ones. So here's links to these videos that are here again on the euthanizing and or dealing with your pet. People will say, "Hey, you shouldn't be showing, you putting a hose in the dog's mouth." It's because the dog might aspirate
Mhm.
some water, so you want the mouth turned down, but using a damp rag. But here's a good figure to show, because I don't want you to inadvertently euthanize a native southern toad.
Right.
That might happen, but uh, there's no shortage of southern toads. They do really well, but we want you to focus on getting rid of those the cane toads. So here's some
Oh,
help
I
on
see.
ID. And then again, I showed you the link to the document. Here are these videos on identification, what to do around your yard, and et cetera. So those are useful links. And if you live in the range of that toad, you need to be aware of this thing because it's potentially bad news for your pet.
And the range again was through North Florida.
Right there. Yeah.
Ah, oh, got it. Okay.
So if you're basically south of Orlando and south, that's DeLand. Here's Orlando. And even though that's in there, there's a lot of records from around here. I'm just
Mhm.
not convinced they're established in breeding. So I would say, you know, basically North Orlando and south, particularly though down here around the Naples
Mhm.
area, Port Charlotte, you need to be aware of this, and
Okay.
there's some
Okay.
people that go out and they do toad busting. They go out at night and they catch these things and they humanely euthanize them. There's even a couple small little businesses that are like yard maintenance businesses, but they'll get they help get rid of toads in your yard, in your
That's
landscape.
interesting.
But we create landscapes that are beneficial for these toads, unfortunately, and so they're a problem we have to deal with. And they were brought in many years ago to try to deal with sugarcane pests. Those
Mhm.
apparently in Florida died out. Elsewhere, they became established, and it's thought that the ones in Florida got established from the escape of some animals brought in for the pet trade in the 1950s. At least that's what's in the scientific literature.
Okay. I had a couple questions about, I think it's a product, I haven't heard of it, but Toadol?
Yeah, where is it? I got that stuff from the folks. It's normally a spray. I haven't tested it. I
Okay.
don't think that they have any scientific proof that it works. I'm not saying that it doesn't work. I'm just saying that I don't have proof that it does work.
And the claim is that, what, can you explain the product and what the claim is?
I don't know. I've talked to the folks and they sent me some of it. Because I don't have a formal research
That,
requirement,
that's
I haven't
okay.
been able to do it. But yeah, there it is. It's total, and you can read what they say.
Okay.
I suspect, as a repellent, it's probably not going to work. So,
Okay.
I don't
I,
know. I'm
I
not
wasn't sure if
advocating
it
it.
was, yeah, I wasn't sure if it was a brand name or a,
It is.
okay,
It's a husband and wife. The guy I think was a chemist and they developed
okay,
it. So
okay.
it says
Well, we'll
treats
leave it at that.
iguanas, other reptiles. I'm going to say I remain skeptical.
Okay,
I can tell you this
that's fine.
Dr. T snake repellent, no scientific evidence that it
Okay,
works. So, you're often going to be susceptible to these things because you really want a solution, but just be pessimistic.
got it. Did you mention house sparrows as an invasive bird?
Yep, yep.
Okay,
House sparrows and
I
house
thought you did.
finches, yeah, they're ones that were brought in New York and they've expanded the range. They're not as common here as they used to be.
Okay,
But it's one of the ones on there. But again, it's not one that there's much management going on to deal with. So
okay,
a note of interest, basically.
okay. Let's see. We've got a ton of questions here, and I'm going to go like maybe till 12:30 because there's so many. I know we
Okay,
usually
yeah, no
stop at
problem.
12:15, but and I appreciate you sticking around. Um, let's see. Uh, gosh, we've got so many. And did you say how to get rid of cane toads?
Yeah,
Live
so
humanely?
so that site that I just showed you, so
Yeah.
let's see here. If you go up to that's my website. That's just the
Mhm.
UF Wildlife Home. And this is learn how to accurately identify them. This is basically
Mhm.
IFAS communications, filming in the lab with preserved specimens, how to
Okay.
treat a family pet. And this would be here about how to hand capture and humanely euthanize. Same thing with Cuban tree frogs. You're kind of using the plastic sack as a grocery sack as a bag and grabbing them, turning that bag inside out, refrigerate it, and then freeze them. That's what I'm going to stick with. I know people have used other things. Oh, I've sprayed them with Raid. That is not humane. It might kill the frog, but it's not humane, and I do not advocate that.
Okay. I know snakes are your thing as well. Do you have information on coral snakes in South Florida? Are they invasive?
Coral snakes are native
That's what
to
I thought.
eastern US, so by default, by definition, they cannot be invasive. Now, if you don't want them around, maybe you say they're a nuisance.
Mhm.
Okay, that's a judgment call, but they are native, so by definition, they are not invasive. And here's your, Florida snake. So if you go down to South
Mhm.
Florida, you click and you'll go to bands, and coral snake will come up. So
Okay.
there they are. You
Um,
can see there's their range throughout the state of Florida. So
wow.
native here.
Sure. Let's see. This viewer thinks that there might be a tegu in her yard.
Take a picture of it and post it to that Ed Maps. Depending on where
Okay.
you live, there you might have to see one.
Okay. And she says that it looks like it's practicing mimicry. Do you know what lizard may do mimicry? May
But
practice? Are
certainly
there a
not
lot of
a
them?
certainly not a tegu. They're
Mhm.
not mimicking. I mean, they're boldly marked. So, speaking of mimics, I mean, you have the scarlet king snake and
Mhm.
one called the scarlet snake that mimics these, but there's nothing that I know of that will mimic a tegu, and it really doesn't have any, need to mimic something
Mhm.
else. I don't know of any good lizard examples in Florida of mimicry
Mhm.
to speak of. But you go to the insect world, insects and plants, mimicry there is just amazing.
Amazing.
So yeah, I'm not sure what you're talking about, but if you're not sure about that lizard, because if you're in South Florida, there's a lot of non-native lizards that are established, and then we have these ones that are pretty big called amivas that get big that you might be seeing. But if you have a decent picture of it, and again, you send it to me at Tadpole, I can help, or you could post it to iNaturalist, and people usually are pretty quick to respond and say it's this or it's that, and you can
Mhm.
get your identification there.
Okay. Um, Another question. What is the large bright green lizard that's very beautiful and shy, tree loving, seems solitary? Do you,
All right,
I know that's not a great description, but
I'm gonna take a guess, but maybe night anole, maybe. And there you go. That's what they look like. So they're from Cuba. They look like kind of like an iguana, but it's an
mm,
anole, so they're related to the brown anole, but they get big. So there's some images of them, and they're down in. Here's one on one from my naturalist. I mean, there you go. Somebody holding it in its hand. They get
wow.
large. There's that dewlap. That might be what it is. Green anoles are excellent climbers. Again, that's the thing about descriptions. I'm really gonna need to see an image to tell you for sure. But it could be
Abs-
these, you know. There's an image
abs-
going in there too. They're really big. They're very bold and kind of a spectacular looking lizard. And they're well established in South Florida.
okay, so what animals prey on brown anoles?
Interesting. Lots of things eat brown anoles. Uh, Snakes like black racers.
Mhm.
also if you're interested in that, here we go again, right? Black snake,
Mhm.
black snake, UFEDIS. This is one I've had this thing has been around a long time. And if you Google all the way to the bottom, you'll see there's our native black racer right there. They feed on lizards. That's a juvenile. They'll feed on lizards as well. So several species of snakes, I'm sure mammals, birds. I have seen a number of species of herons stalking brown anoles. I even one time saw a little Carolina wren grab a brown knoll on my front driveway, thwack the knoll on the ground, brought it into the garage in my garage where they had their messy nest and fed the young. So lots of things will be feeding on brown knolls. Heck, this nine and all, those things would eat brown knolls. Curly-tailed lizards will eat brown knolls. Lots of stuff. Lots of native and non-native animals feed on brown knolls in Florida.
As curly tail lizards, we have a question about that. Are they poisonous?
No,
Okay.
I'm currently working on a document on them. Uh, Yep, because they're really common in Central and South Florida. So here's some images of them. No,
Oh, wow.
now, yeah, that's just a common lizard. It's one of the publications that we did with my students that I haven't published yet. So I'm working
Okay.
on that now. No,
Okay.
none of these lizards in Florida are venomous, and
Okay.
venoms are injected, poisons are ingested. So the only venomous
Hmm.
lizard we have in the United States is the beaded lizard or Heloderma suspectum. They're out in the Southwest Florida. Uh, Occasionally, people will say that the that skinks. So let's see,
Mhm.
so broad-headed, yeah, skink. So when they're juveniles, they have blue on their tails,
Mhm.
and people will say that blue the blue tails are poisonous. I don't know that that's the case. Your cat might puke after it attacks one, but if your cat's inside, you don't have to worry about it, right? So, but no poisonous lizards in Florida, and no venomous lizards naturally in Florida.
I'm going to end on this question. That might take you a second. So iguanas.
Yep.
Um, how do you repel iguanas in your yard? Can you give us some advice on anything iguana?
Get don't plant plants that iguanas like to eat. I don't know what else to tell you. I don't know any proven repellents. You
Okay.
can try. Let's see, where are we?
I know people will tell you on this webinar, people who watch often, they eat everything.
Yeah,
They'll say they eat every plant. So,
fine. So here's one we did also on green iguanas. And
okay.
I'm not an expert on green iguanas, but they just, also brought in by the pet trade. Now you can, if you can discharge a firearm in your yard, and sometimes people using these pellet guns, these high
Mhm.
power pellet guns, you can shoot iguanas. And there's I don't know, maybe 2 dozen natural areas in the state of Florida now that non-native species, green iguanas being one, are allowed to be hunted. Uh,
Okay.
don't think that we're ever going to eradicate iguanas from, via that. Same thing with this python, this python challenge. We're not going to get rid of pythons in the Everglades with the python challenge, but it does bring awareness to
Right.
things. So green iguana is just maybe, I don't even know what to tell you. If you're in South Florida, you don't plant what they like to eat. They're good climbers. They're quite arboreal. They can probably climb over a fence. Uh, yeah, that's a tough one to deal with, and they're brought in for the pet trade, and now they've become, a problem. As a matter of fact, I'm going on in some email exchanges right now about some vegetable growers are having problems in South Florida with iguanas getting into their
Mhm.
fields, and if they defecate, they can. You don't want animal feces in your
Mhm.
vegetables. It's not a real problem yet or anything. You don't have to worry about food safety, but it's becoming a concern in places. So, yeah, read this. I would say you just, if you Google,
Mhm.
green iguana in Florida fetus, you can get a little bit of advice there, but that sometimes we just got to live with. We don't have much of a solution, and I think the lesson here is, let's not have the next green iguana in Florida. Let's prevent it from happening again. Let's learn from history and learn from our mistakes. But we know we're humans, and we don't always do that very well. But yeah,
Right.
sorry I don't have a
That's all right.
do this and you'll be fine. But I don't know that this iguana rid stuff. As a matter of fact, I have a container sitting over there, never tested it, but I remain highly skeptical until I see some peer-reviewed scientific evidence by somebody who's unbiased, not the company that manufactures it. They clearly
Right.
have something to gain if they say it works. But I would just be apprehensive. Definitely not mothballs, but I don't think this iguana ridge stuff really works well either, but
For more information on iguanas, or what might work around your county, you can also contact your local county extension office. They might have just know a little bit more locally what's going on with that situation. So,
and
um,
if you find
Dr.
out something that works 100%, you let me know, please. I will be an advocate of something if I know it works.
Sure. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a wonderful presentation that obviously we haven't had a lot of invasive animal presentations, but it's very important for our environment and for our gardens and for our plants and landscapes. So I appreciate you joining us today.
You're quite welcome, and thanks to all the listeners for being here. Reach out to me with an email. I'll do my best to respond. Again, thanks for listening to what I had to say. Appreciate it.
Tadpole.ufl.edu. That's Dr. Johnson's email. So everybody have a great day. We will see you next month for Dr. Gail Hansen and some landscape design. Thank you all.